Lenny Bruce wasn't just a comedian, he was a force of nature, a man who tore through the fabric of 1950s and 60s America with wit as sharp as a knife and a voice that refused to be silenced. In a world where comedy was meant to be light, palatable, and safe, Bruce was a shock to the system, a renegade who dared to speak the unspeakable, challenge the sacred, and mock the powerful. His life was a roller coaster of genius and torment, of laughter and tears, and ultimately, of triumph and tragedy. Bruce's journey from a small-time nightclub performer to a martyr for free speech is a story of defiance, self-destruction, and a legacy that transcends time. Born Leonard Alfred Schneider on October 13, 1925, in the unassuming town of Mineola, New York, Lenny Bruce's early life seemed destined for anything but greatness. His parents' divorce when he was just 5 years old set the stage for a childhood filled with instability and longing. Raised by his mother, Sally Marr, a stage performer with dreams of her own, Bruce was introduced to the world of entertainment early on. Marr was a free spirit, a woman who embraced life with a boldness that would later manifest in her son. She was Bruce's first and perhaps most influential teacher, instilling in him a love for the stage and a disdain for convention. As a teenager, Bruce was restless and rebellious. He drifted through various schools, never quite fitting in, always feeling like an outsider. Formal education couldn't hold his attention, the real lessons he craved were out there in the world, in the smoky clubs and underbelly of New York, where humor was raw, real, and unfiltered. It was during these formative years that Bruce began to develop his unique style of comedy, a style that was more than just jokes, it was a commentary on the absurdities of life. After a brief stint in the Navy during World War II, Bruce returned to New York, but the experiences of war had changed him. He was no longer just a boy trying to find his way, he was a man with a mission. He wanted to be a comedian, but not just any comedian, he wanted to be the voice of a generation, the one who said what everyone else was too afraid to say. The 1950s were a time of conformity in America. The nation was riding a wave of post-war prosperity, and the prevailing culture was one of conservatism and uniformity. In this environment, comedy was expected to be safe, family-friendly, and uncontroversial. But Lenny Bruce had other ideas. He didn't want to tell jokes about mother-in-laws and pie-in-the-face gags, he wanted to talk about the things that mattered, race, religion, sex, politics. And he wanted to do it in a way that no one else had ever dared. Bruce's early career was a slow burn. He started out performing in small clubs, honing his craft, pushing the boundaries a little further each night. His material was unlike anything audiences had seen before. It was sharp, biting, and often uncomfortable. But it was also hilarious, and more importantly, it was honest. Bruce didn't just tell jokes, he held up a mirror to society and forced people to confront their own hypocrisies. One of his earliest successes was a routine called Religions Incorporated, in which he lampooned organized religion with a fearlessness that was both shocking and exhilarating. In an era when questioning religion was considered taboo, Bruce's routine was a breath of fresh air, or a slap in the face, depending on your perspective. But it wasn't just religion that Bruce went after, nothing was off limits. He tackled racism with the same fervor, using humor to expose the absurdity of segregation and prejudice. Bruce's comedy was revolutionary because it wasn't just about getting laughs, it was about making people think. He was less interested in punchlines and more interested in the truth, no matter how uncomfortable that truth might be. His routines were a mix of social commentary, satire, and confessional monologue, delivered with a style that was both casual and intense, as if he were having a conversation with the audience rather than performing for them. As Bruce's fame grew, so did the controversies surrounding him. Audiences were divided, some hailed him as a genius, a trailblazer who was pushing comedy into new and exciting territory. Others saw him as a menace, a foul-mouthed provocateur who was corrupting the nation's morals. But love him or hate him, there was no denying that Lenny Bruce was a force to be reckoned with. Lenny Bruce's rise to fame was meteoric, but it came at a steep price. As his material became more provocative, he found himself increasingly at odds with the law. In an America still clinging to its puritanical roots, Bruce's frank discussions of sex, religion, and politics were seen as obscene. The authorities were determined to silence him, and they used the full force of the law to do so. The first of many legal battles came in 1961, when Bruce was arrested in San Francisco for using what was considered obscene language during a performance. The word in question was cocksucker, a term that today might barely raise an eyebrow but was scandalous at the time. Bruce was charged with obscenity, and although he was acquitted, it was just the beginning of a long and harrowing series of legal troubles. Over the next few years, Bruce was arrested numerous times across the country for obscenity. His performances were monitored by law enforcement, and he was frequently arrested immediately after stepping off stage. The charges were always the same: obscenity, indecency, corruption of morals. But for Bruce, these arrests were not just legal matters, they were battles in a larger war for free speech. Bruce saw himself as a martyr for the cause of free expression. He believed that comedy was not just entertainment but a vital form of social commentary, and that silencing comedians like him was an attack on the very fabric of democracy. His legal battles became part of his act, as he would often spend large portions of his performances discussing his arrests and the absurdity of the charges against him. But the constant pressure of these legal issues began to take its toll. Bruce's health deteriorated under the stress, and his once sharp routines became increasingly erratic. His comedy, once filled with biting social commentary, started to devolve into bitter rants about the injustices he was facing. The audiences who had once flocked to see him now found themselves watching a man unravel on stage. Despite his legal troubles, Bruce refused to back down. He continued to perform, continued to push the boundaries, even as the walls closed in around him. He believed in his cause, believed that what he was doing was important, even if it was killing him. Lenny Bruce's legal battles were only part of his struggles. Behind the scenes, he was fighting a much more personal war, one that would ultimately lead to his downfall. Like many of his contemporaries, Bruce turned to drugs as a way to cope with the pressures of his life. What started as occasional use soon spiraled into full-blown addiction. Heroin became Bruce's drug of choice, a dangerous companion that both fueled his creativity and hastened his decline. The drugs numbed the pain, dulled the fear, and allowed him to keep performing, but they also eroded his health, his relationships, and his career. Bruce's addiction was no secret, it was evident in his increasingly gaunt appearance, his erratic behavior, and the decline in the quality of his performances. But Bruce was not just a victim of addiction, he was also a victim of the times. The 1950s and 60s were a period of great social upheaval, but they were also a time when the understanding of addiction was limited. There was little sympathy or help available for those struggling with substance abuse. Instead of receiving the support he needed, Bruce was often vilified for his drug use, further isolating him from those who might have been able to help. As his addiction worsened, so did his legal troubles. His arrests were no longer just for obscenity but also for drug possession. Each new charge was another nail in the coffin of his career. Venues became hesitant to book him, audiences dwindled, and the once celebrated comedian found himself performing to half-empty rooms. Yet even in his darkest moments, Bruce's genius shone through. There were still flashes of the brilliance that had made him famous, the sharp wit, the fearless social commentary. But these moments were becoming increasingly rare, buried under layers of bitterness, paranoia, and despair. By 1966, Lenny Bruce was a shadow of his former self. His health was failing, his finances were in ruins, and his once promising career was in tatters. The legal battles had taken everything from him, his money, his peace of mind, his ability to perform. But they hadn't taken his spirit. Even in his final days, Bruce remained defiant, convinced that his fight was a righteous one. On August 3, 1966, Lenny Bruce was found dead in his Hollywood Hills home, the victim of a drug overdose. He was 40 years old. The official cause of death was acute morphine poisoning, a stark reminder of the demons that had plagued him throughout his life. Bruce's death was a tragic end to a life that had been full of promise, but it was also a symbol of the price he had paid for his principles. In the aftermath of his death, Lenny Bruce's legacy began to take shape. He was no longer just a controversial comedian, he was a martyr for free speech, a man who had given everything in the fight against censorship. His obscenity trials became a turning point in the battle for artistic freedom in America, and his work became a touchstone for future generations of comedians. In 2003, nearly 4 decades after his death, Lenny Bruce was posthumously pardoned by the governor of New York, an acknowledgement of the injustice he had faced during his lifetime. It was a symbolic victory, one that came too late to save Bruce but served as a reminder of the importance of the fight he had waged.